All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Dawn Zauner, and I am a writer who interviews other writers in order to make other writers even better writers. And today we are meeting with Adam Scott. Hi, Adam.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Hey, can you hear me?
Hey. All right. I already done a little introduction for the video, but your debut album, your debut book just came out.
I'd quite like to have a debut album.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about your first book?
Sure. Well, Absolution Point is a young adult adventure story that is more than a little bit inspired by the Musketeers stories. It's following two storylines. It's set in the very, very distant future. And we follow two characters, one of whom is a young boy called Matthew Hawks, who is 15 years old when we meet him in the story. He and his friends are caught stealing a spaceship that belongs to somebody very, very important. They are arrested. His friends are both sent off to prison, but he's given a choice as to whether he wants to serve, whether he wants to go to prison or to serve his sentence in the Imperial Guard, working for the Emperor and trying to find redemption that way. So, of course, he takes that option and he goes off, and his story follows his training on there. The second strand of the story follows the character of Rowan Tannenbay, who is the princess of the Imperium. She was never supposed to be in line for the throne, but her parents were killed by terrorists several years before our story begins. And now her grandfather, the Emperor, is dying, and the reality is that she is going to become the Empress. And we follow her story as it goes through that. And the stage is set for the two characters to eventually meet, and the story continues from there, and it's what happens from that point.
That is awesome.
Thank you.
I believe, and it's available on Amazon, right?
It is available on Amazon. Yes, it's available on Kindle and on paperback. And it's in Kindle Unlimited as well for anyone who's a member of that. So if you remember that, it can be read for free through Kindle Unlimited.
Very neat. You tweeted me the link, Absolute Point, right?
Absolution Point, yes.
Absolution Point. And I'm going to go ahead and right now and purchase that on Amazon because I can.
Fantastic. You've just made my day there.
Very cool. I'm excited to read this. I like to read all different kinds of genre. Like I write all different kinds of genre, so it's good to read all different types too.
I'm the same. I'm completely omnivorous when it comes to what I'm reading. I read all sorts. Good stories, all I'm bothered about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to read as much as you write. I mean, that's where you find a lot of your techniques that you come up with, and you really find your own voice as a writer. How did you find your voice as a writer? Like, what practices did you take to come to that point?
I'm not sure I have yet. I'm not sure that's something that's I think that's something other people decide rather than it being something that I decide, because it's like I'm very much of the belief that you do the work and your voice, your themes, etc., that just happens if you're writing honestly, basically. And so I just try and concentrate on telling good stories, and I know what I like in terms of what I want to see on the page, in terms of how I want to see a story structured, in terms of how I want to see things play out. So I think it just boils down to your own taste, and that comes from reading a lot, and there's nowhere else it can come from, I don't think.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, I'm an English major and I write all the time, and still, I mean, I think that there's always something that new to learn. There's always a different writing prompt that'll lead you in a different direction. But when you were writing, did you have a specific habit set up? Did you have a writing space? Did you have kind of a habit, like a specific time that you write? Like, what is your writing process like on a daily basis?
Right. Okay. Well, I work full time. I have a full-time job. I work 4 days a week for a bank, so I have to kind of fit that in. I have to kind of fit the writing in around that. So it's whatever I can get done in the evenings, and then it's most of the days on the days that I'm not working. So pre-pandemic, my one big ritual thing was I used to like going to Sunday mornings used to be my thing. I used to go into various coffee shops and write there, take my laptop out and go and write with that. So that's obviously now all gone out the window now that the pandemic's happened. So I've been a lot more writing from home. But I have my writing space. I have a desk in my room here, and anybody that follows me on Instagram, I am there as Adam Scott Writes on there. You'll be able to see my desk in my working space. I do post pictures of it quite a lot. So you can see that. You can see that from there. And in terms of habits, it's kind of a little bit all over the place. I mean, sometimes I very much like writing by hand. That's something that I've been doing for a long time. It was one of the best pieces of writing advice I ever got given was, I sort of read it in an interview with a gentleman called Drew Goddard, who is a screenwriter. He wrote the script for The Martian, for the Ridley Scott film, amongst other things. Really good guy, knows what he's doing, he knows what he's talking about. And he said the best bit of advice he'd ever been given was, whatever you do your writing on, do the opposite. Whatever you do for your work, do the opposite for your writing. So if you're working all day on a computer, go and handwrite, because it'll trick your brain into thinking you're doing something for the fun of it rather than it being a job. And I swear to God, it's the best piece of writing advice I've ever been given. And so I tend to write by hand a lot. I'll write in a notebook, and then when I get to the end of that particular scene, I'll type it up and edit it, which then becomes like, it's like doing two drafts at once, basically. So that's a very useful technique.
I tend to mix it up a bit. Sometimes I write on my computer, sometimes I write in a notebook, and then I actually just got a typewriter, which I'm really enjoying.
Oh wow. It's fantastic. I never quite got the typewriter thing, but I love notebooks, and I love notebooks, and I love fountain pens. So, like for instance, I've got a box of the things here. So these are the ones I'm working on at the moment. So
yep.
I don't know if you can see that. So I have piles of these things lying around, and that's what I'm working with there. Yeah, that's basically me. I'm very much like fountain pens. I've always liked writing by hand.
Yeah. And I understand definitely trying to fit writing in with a full-time job too. I mean, I admire writers who actually have a set time every day that they sit down and write for an hour or 2 hours. And like with a work schedule and all of your responsibilities at home and things like that, it's so hard to be able to keep that kind of schedule. But
Yeah.
I mean, even if you don't have that set time or set amount of time that you write every day, it's important to make sure that when you do have time to write, you're passionate about it. You're in the right mindset to write. I mean, a lot of people focus on your physical space that you write in, your desk, your office, but I think a big part of that is also your mental writing space. Like, where do you go mentally when you sit down to write, and be able to get into your story the way that you want your readers to get into your story?
Absolutely. For me, I tend to do that. I do that a couple of different ways. The first thing is, I have a couple of very hard and fast rules. I don't ever sit down to write unless I'm in the mood for it. So like, having a schedule's all well and good, but if you sit down and you're not in the mood, it's a waste of time. You're just going to end up writing crap that you're going to have to cut, basically. There. So I only ever sit down if I know that I'm in the mood for it, and I only ever sit down to do it if I know what I'm writing. That doesn't necessarily mean I have to have outlined everything, but I need to at least know what I'm doing on that particular day. Because for me anyway, if I'm not working towards a goal, then it's just finger painting. It's not writing. It's you're kind of flailing around and don't know what you're doing. So I've learned the hard way that I have to have those two things in order to, before I sit down. The other thing with me is music. I make these fantastically long playlists for every project that I work on, and I'll pick like 3 or 4 songs that suit, 3 or 4 tracks rather, I should say, because it's mostly orchestral music, that I'll listen to that suit the mood of the particular scene that I'm trying to write, and then I'll have that on repeat going. So it's kind of a way of blocking it out, but it also then works like, by the time I'm done, I've got a very, very long playlist of like 300 tracks or something. That's like an outline of that book in music form, basically. There. So that really works for me. And then if I have to go back and revise something, I can play that as well. And it puts me back in the headspace of that very quickly.
Absolutely. And I think a big portion of that, especially with with knowing what you're going to write before you sit down to write is knowing that you're going to start in some sort of action sequence. And whenever you sit down to write, to know that you're going to jump right in and put that passion onto paper. I think
Yeah.
the blank page and starting from that very first sentence is always daunting. But if you start in an action scene, it jump starts that whole process and kind of can overcome the fear of starting and figuring out what to say in the beginning too.
That can be very much a thing, and Absolution Point does open with an action sequence, in fact. So that's very true. But it's not even necessarily that it has to be action. It's just I need to know what I'm doing. There needs to be. I'm very much a believer in the building blocks for me for storytelling is intention and obstacle. Someone wants something, someone's trying to something standing in the way of getting it. If I've got that, it doesn't matter what kind of scene I'm writing. It could be, the guy could want to get on it could be a scene with a guy wanting to get on a train and there's something preventing him from doing that. But that's a scene. There's a goal and there's something getting in the way there. So if I've got that, I can do it. If it's any more vague than that, then I'm not ready. I don't know the scene isn't right. I'm not there. So I have to wait until I've got that. The good news is it's very easy to come up with that stuff because if you're stuck, you can just think to yourself, okay, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? This character wants this thing. What's the worst thing that could possibly happen? Have that happen and then figure out how they're going to get around it. So
Yes.
that works for me. And I remember once being asked by somebody, how do you decide whether what you're writing is a plot scene or a character scene? And I kind of got thrown by that because I was like, I don't really understand what the difference is because like where does that come down? So like for me, character is revealed by plot and plot happens from characters interacting. So I don't get where that distinction is. So for me, it comes down to as simple as that. It's what does this person want? How far will they go to get it? What will somebody else do to stop them? And it's as simple as that, basically.
Absolutely. And I think having an outline in the beginning is one of the most essential things. I mean, you hear some writers who say they just free write, they just start with one idea or one character and they just kind of roll with it from there. And I can't imagine that because I have, I mean, probably 50 books outlined right now that I need to sit down and write, but I can
Yeah.
do the outlines. The outlines are the fun part for me because I can do that exact process that you were talking about, create a situation, find out what the worst thing can happen, and then have that happen, and then try to figure out an ending to it. And I think that's one of the most fun parts for me for the writing process, is making the outline and then being able to sit down and write. It does require a lot of inspiration, that isn't there every single day. So if you wanted to write every single day, how do you inspire yourself? Like if you know you have a deadline coming up, how do you get yourself into the mood to write if you know that you're already not?
That's a good question. Having an outline helps enormously, and I do outline my work. I'm kind of the opposite of you in that I'm the other way around. I hate outlining. I find that outline, well, actually, that's not entirely true. Outlining for me is either really, really easy or really, really difficult. It's either I've got the whole thing in my head and I know what I'm doing, or I'm kind of figuring out how does this thing connect to this thing and where does this thing come into it here and what's this person doing over here. And for me, that can be really tricky because it's the one bit of the process to me that is mechanics and not art, if you see what I mean there. So that can be quite tricky. So I try and write. So I do like to have an outline, but I try and write them quickly and I try not to overthink it particularly. I need to know where I'm going. Because the other thing I've discovered the hard way is that it's possible to over outline something. It's possible to think something through too much, and then inevitably what happens is you get the story on its feet and you think of a better idea. You get characters interact. You think, actually, no, this person wouldn't do that. This person would do this, and that's going to mess this thing up later on. So I've got to course correct. And if you've got an outline that's too rigid, then you're kind of stuck at that point. So I like to keep it a little bit more loose than that. The big thing for me is I don't think in terms of chapters, I think in terms of scenes. So my outlines never show where the chapter breaks are. I just almost bullet point what the scenes are. And something that you write a paragraph for in an outline, I find you can sometimes do in one sentence. And then by contrast, something that you think is going to take like half a page ends up being 10 pages and split over two different scenes. So you can never tell until you actually get into it. So I've learned to just roll with that, basically. So I know where I'm going, but then I give myself a fair bit of room to maneuver as I'm going there. But so long as I've got the destination, I know where I'm going point to point. I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's easier. I know where, if I know where I'm going, it's just a question of getting there.
It sounds like you follow more of the three act structure when you're writing, rather than kind of a like you said, a more rigid outline where it takes you chapter by chapter. It kind of seems like you follow more of a three act structure, like you would write a movie, when it comes to your writing, as in you're creating those scenes and you're working through scene by scene.
Yeah, the three act structure is very useful. It's not something I don't think it's something to get too hung up on, because for me, I tend to think, I tend to think story, for me, tend to go with a more classical structure, which is 5 acts. It's introduction, rising action, complication, climax, denouement. And I kind of think in those terms. I think the other thing as well is that I think structure should be invisible. It's either, if the reader is noticing the structure, you've done something wrong. It's and I think it's something that writers get more hung up on about than readers are. Readers don't care about stuff like that, and it's important to remember that hopefully you are writing for a reader at the other end of this thing. So I try and make stuff as accessible as possible. I try not to get too bogged down in technicalities with stuff like that. I like to have I think all stories have a shape, and I like to know what that shape is going in, but within that I can do a fair old bit. So I like the freedom of being able to do that.
It's so interesting that you said that, if your reader notices your structure, you're doing something wrong. I mean,
Yeah.
I started reading a book the other day, and halfway through I was like, I know exactly how this is going to end. There's no point I'm me finishing reading this book, and I closed it. And I mean, and I hate that, because I love to read and I love the stories, and I think that's one of the most truest things that you could ever say as a writer, is making sure that your reader can't anticipate the ending before they get to it. And
Mm.
I think that's amazing. And one of the things I always look for at the end of a book is making sure all the loose ends are tied up. How did you work through that with your book, to kind of go through and making sure that the symbols that you mentioned were tied into the ending, and different things like that? Like, how did you tie everything together? What was that process like?
like, like I say, knowing the ending helps. Knowing where you're going for really helps. But when it got into the editing, I was literally going through and making a list of like, okay, I've set this thing up. Does it pay off? Does it pay off in a good way? I've set this thing up. Does it pay off? Do I need to pay that off here? Is that something that needs to have a resolution? Is it something, because I'm writing a series? So is this something is it something that I can worry about later on? And there's not really an answer to that side of it other than gut instinct. You go with what feels right there, then. But I think I think because I revise all the time when I'm writing. I don't like I say, when I handwrite a scene, I type it up, and you naturally end up correcting that anyway as you go in, because if you've written a bad sentence, you'll just fix it without thinking about it as you're typing it up there. But then every so often I will stop and I'll go back through a chunk of the manuscript and reread it and edit it that way as well. So, and as I'm doing that, I'm constantly making revision list of like, okay, this thing needs to be better set up, or this thing kind of comes out of nowhere. I need to drop a thing into an earlier chapter to set it up better, or this thing's happening but it's not actually helping me. I need to cut it out. And so it's kind of an ongoing thing, because I hate doing multiple drafts of things. I've discovered I like to try and get it done, get it all done in as comprehensive a manner first time around. So for me, it's a case of like I say, just I make lists and then I'll work through them as part of the revision stage. But that's an ongoing thing. Because the other reason I don't like doing multiple drafts is I've learned the hard way that there's a limited number of times I can reread something before I start getting bored with it and hating every word of it. And it's possible to over revise something and kill anything that was interesting about it in the first place. So I kind of have to be a little bit more precise with what I'm doing there.
And when it's so interesting, because when you are making all those revisions after you finish your draft and you have revised it so many times, like, how do you get to the point of saying, okay, it's ready? Where, how do you get
That's a
to that
scary
point to
that's a
decide,
scary
okay,
step, particularly for somebody who's self-published. That's a scary step with that. I've got 3 or 4 people that read my stuff that I trust implicitly and that I know will not tell me, they'll not just tell me what I want to hear. If something's wrong, they'll actually say to me, Adam, this thing doesn't work, you need to fix it, this thing's problematic. So I trust in that. And then it's just a lot of very careful work through it, and it's like trying to get as much done as possible as you're going. So it's like I said, because I revise constantly, by the time I get to the end of the draft, it's usually pretty clean and pretty solid at that point. It's then just a case of getting somebody else to go through it and make sure that I've not done something embarrassing while it's going through, or I've not set up something that doesn't go anywhere, or I've not got this character speaking this character's dialogue or anything silly like that. Which, because there's certain things you can't see like that, and you do need to have somebody else to have a look at it there. But once this has been through 3 sets of revisions from different people, and then I'd gone back over it one last time to do that, I thought to myself, okay, this is as good as I think I can get it. I've been incredibly careful with it. I think this is now ready. I'm confident to send this out into the world at this point.
yeah, and I think having those beta readers is very, very important. And I think a lot of people, when they first finish a book, it's their baby, it's their masterpiece. So they don't want.
Oh, I'm sorry, I've just lost the audio there. I can't hear what you're saying. I can hear you again now, yes.
Okay. I was just saying that when you finish that piece of work and you have that masterpiece done, you sometimes don't want that criticism that can come from strangers or from readers, but that's exactly what you need in that situation. I think a lot of people would rather trust their friends and family to read it first because they're going to be nicer to you about it. But at the same point, they may not tell you something that's wrong with the book that you need to fix before it goes to publication. So I think selecting those beta readers and knowing who those people are that are going to give you feedback that is necessary, that is what you need to revise, I think is really a crucial step.
I agree, and that's never been something that's bothered me particularly. In as much as I'm always actively looking for feedback with that type of thing. I'm not one. I try not to be one of these people that is just sort of hoarding stuff in secret and never showing it to anybody, because ultimately I'm writing because I want people to read this. So we want to have it in a good state when it goes out to people there. So, and I used to be part of an online writers group for many, many years. So that killed a lot of my fears that I might have about exposing my work before it was necessarily complete there. I think if you trust the people that it's going to, and you know that it's someone that's going to be honest with you, then I think you're fine. But it is about, but you do need to find somebody that will do that for you, because at the same time as you don't want people to just say, oh, this is great, this is fantastic, it's really, really good, you should be very proud of yourself, when you know that there's stuff wrong with it. At the same time, you don't also want people that'll just be really harsh with you for the sake of being really harsh with you. That's no help either. And that can really knock your confidence. So for me, that's why having a group of people is useful. It's like if one person says something is a problem, but 2 other people don't, it's like, okay, that's down to individual taste. If all 3 people are telling you that there's a problem, it's like, okay, there's something here. There's something is bothering people here. What's the root of the problem? How do I fix it there? But ultimately realizing at the same time that it's my book and it's my decision what I want to put in there, and you can't write things by committee. It has to be the work of one person. Otherwise, it's not going to be the thing that I want it to be.
Absolutely. And I think that fear of putting your work out there, being published, is one of the has probably the top fear that all writers have. And because you can't please everyone. So no matter what you write and how you end it, and what kind of plot sequence you choose to go with, you're always going to have somebody who doesn't agree with it or somebody who doesn't like it. And I think that fear right there is probably what stops a lot of people from writing the story that they have to tell. And I think that having ways for people to overcome that fear is definitely helpful. And I think beta readers are definitely a good way to do that. that, especially if you have them kind of following along with your story as you write it. Um, Whereas, like right now, I have a story that I'm writing, and I have two people who are reading it, reading about 1,000 words a week as I write, so they can kind of follow along the story as I go. And that really helps me as far as getting rid of that major fear factor of putting my work out there. But having beta readers read it afterwards and then making those revisions, it's also a good way to go too, because that way
Mm.
you kind of get the whole story all together. They can see how everything.
I lost the audio a little bit towards the end there, but I think I know what you said. Well, I think I know what you're saying there. Can you hear me all right, incidentally? Can you hear me?
No, I can't hear you. I'm not
Oh,
sure
I
what
can
happened.
hear you again now. I can hear you again now. Right. Yeah, I lost the audio towards the end there, but I think I got the gist of the question. So, yeah, that's interesting what you said there, because I don't ever show people chunks of the work while it's in process like that. That doesn't work for me, because because it's easy to then get bogged down in the details, particularly when you write the first draft. It's very easy then to get bogged down in details like, what did it mean when this person said this, or what is it, what's the significance of this, is this something we're going back to? And you find that someone's getting hung up on something that's actually just a minor detail and you're never going to come back to ever again, but for them it's suddenly become the whole story. And like, that can be tricky to deal with, and it can knock your confidence at the point when you don't want it knocked. So for me, I have people that I have friends that I can talk to about my work in progress. I'll usually tell them the story, what I'm doing. I say, right, this is a thing about such and such, and this person's going to do this, and this person's going to do that, and ultimately it's going to end up here, so that they've got a frame of context. And I might talk to them about, right, I've got a problem with this particular scene. In it, this happens, this happens, this happens, and I should be going here, but I'm actually ending up here. How do I fix it? Something along those lines. And people who I can trust to talk it through with me. But I won't show anybody a whole or part of a manuscript until I've at least got a draft done, because it's too easy to get focused on the trees rather than looking at the forest. And when you're writing the first draft, you've got to just be thinking about the forest the entire time. You've got to be thinking about the whole story. So it's very easy to get bogged down with stuff like that if you're not careful. So for me, that process wouldn't work at all. But the method that I've got does, and I learned that the hard way again through being members of various writers group over the years there. So it's important to figure out what works for you. And for me, it's like, I have to get through the thing, and I have to have the confidence in the material to get through the thing. So I don't talk about my work until it's done. But then once it's done, I'm quite happy to expose it, let people look at it. But you can't I don't think that anyone can make a decision or make an objective opinion on something until they've seen the whole thing. I think asking people to comment on parts of it is sometimes a problem for me.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I think every writer needs to find what their process is, what works for them. And
Yeah.
I think that's one of the main reasons why I'm starting this YouTube channel and doing these interviews with different writers, because different writers do different things. And I don't want, let's say, somebody who really wants to write a book but has only learned one way of writing, and that discouraged them
Mm.
because it doesn't work for them. I want all those writers to know that you don't have to follow just one path. You don't have to, just because you want to write novels like Stephen King, you don't have to follow his path of writing, his structure of writing. Everyone kind of has to play with it and see what works for them and what doesn't. You have to try out different things in order to really figure out what is going to work best for you and what's going to work best for that story. I mean, sometimes if you're writing two different genres at the same time, one process might work well for fiction, but it's not going to work for something that's nonfiction. So you also kind of have to write it on a story by story basis and adjust it
Exactly.
along the way.
Exactly, and this is the key thing that writers need to bear in mind, and it is something that I struggled with for a little while. But there isn't any one way of doing this. There isn't a right way and a wrong way. I remember hearing one very, very famous writer, who I won't name here, saying that anybody that outlines their stories in advance is morally bankrupt and has no right to call themselves a storyteller, because they're not leaving themselves open to the possibilities of creation. And that phrase sticks in my head and haunts me to a certain extent, because it's like, number one, like, no, any writer that tells another writer how they must do something can fuck right off, quite frankly. And so it's everybody's got to do their own thing. And secondly, like, it's not going to work. There is no method that's going to work for everybody, and you have to find your own rhythm. If that means that you have to have a bullet point list of scenes that you're going to write beforehand, great. If you've got to have a 200-page outline of a 400-page book before you get started, fantastic. If you just start in and see what happens, great. So long as it works for you. No one's going to tell you that there is a right way and a wrong way to do it. It's just about, you have to try a lot of things and you have to figure out what works for you. I learned the hard way that I need to have some sort of idea where I'm going, even if it's not necessarily a full outline. I've also learned the dangers of over outlining, because it can kill the enthusiasm that you might have for the story before you get into it. I've learned that I can come up with a very basic idea and rattle off a short story in half an hour with that, but I could never, without having thought it through, and be really shocked by the ending. But I could never do that with a novel, because it's just too long and there's too many things that you have to keep track of. So it's just about figuring out what's going to work for you and having the confidence to say, this is my process, this is how I work.
And being comfortable with your own process is definitely important, and getting there is probably one of the hardest parts of writing, especially in the beginning, because you kind of have to learn everything the hard way when it comes to
Yes.
figuring out what your process is, because you have to try out different things and see what works. And I think when it comes to writing, is knowing what your process is important, but also knowing what your end goal is important. I mean, if you write short stories, are you just publishing them for different contests and awards, or are you looking to compile a bunch of short stories for a collection? If you're writing a novel, is your goal to be published? Like, what exactly is your goal, so you know what you're working towards? And I mean, for me, even with poetry, I mean, I want to compile all of my poetry into a collection and publish it. With my fiction books, it's going to be publishing. Everything for me, my end goal is going to be getting published, and then after that, making it on the bestsellers list, because that's what every writer wants.
Absolutely. Interesting you mentioned the right way and you mentioned the easy way and the hard way there, because it's just triggered off. One of my favorite authors is the English author Terry Pratchett, and he came out with a brilliant line which has always stuck with me, which is, the difference between the easy way and the hard way is that the hard way works. And that has always stuck with me. It's like there isn't an easy way to do this. So like, when I first decided I was going to try writing a novel, I spent the best part of nearly a year and a half writing this novel, and I threw everything at it. I turned my ideas bucket upside down and dumped the entire contents out onto the thing. When I finished, it was like 18 months later. I tried everything. I tried free writing. I tried really uber outlining. I tried not outlining. I tried point by point. I tried going back and revising. I tried junking the whole thing several times and starting from the beginning. I literally tried absolutely everything. When I got to the end of that, like 15 months later or whatever it was, and finally wrote the end, it was the greatest feeling ever. And I knew two things straight away. I knew, first of all, that I had done it. I'd done the most important thing that you can do with any kind of writing project, which is finish. So I knew that I'd done that. And secondly, I knew that there was no way anybody was ever going to see this thing, because it just sucked out loud. It was honestly terrible, and it's laughable looking back at how bad it is now. But I've still got it in my drawer. I still have it there I still have this wedge of manuscript printed out that's about that big, and I've still got it there now as kind of a badge of honor. But I don't consider that 15 months that I threw at this wasted time, because over the course of that, I was teaching myself how to write a book. And towards the end of it, I figured out what worked for me, and I got into a rhythm. And like 2 days after I'd finished that, I picked myself up and started writing again. I started writing something else. That book ended up being Absolution Point, and it's published now. So, I would not. So for all that first book that I wrote is so laughably bad, it's unbelievable. I'd never, ever have wished for that time to be anything other than that, because it taught me how to do this. And there is no better way to do this than just by chucking yourself in and doing it and figuring out what works for you, and making sure for me, it is all about getting to the end. It's the most important thing you can do is finish. And if you're not finishing, then you're not going to get anywhere anyway. You're never going to get any better. You've got to complete something and then go on to the next thing.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that it's I think one of the biggest fears, especially for me as writing, when I first started writing, I thought that everything that made it onto the paper was going to be seen by someone. So I would always rewrite the same sentence again and again and again. And I think that's a common fear for a lot of beginner writers, is that as soon
Mm.
as you put it on paper, you think that it has to be perfect, and it just doesn't. I mean, in the beginning, when you're first starting writing, even if you've been writing for a long time, there's a big difference between having a story in your head and actually writing it out on paper. And
Oh, you've gone again. Sorry, the image is frozen. I can't hear anything. We'll just have to give it a second. It'll sort itself out.
okay.
You're back now. You're back now. Again, I think I got.
Okay.
I think I got the. Again, I think I got the gist of that, and I agree with it entirely. You've got to just get to. You've got to just get to the end. You've got to. And it's one of the reasons I actually like handwriting, because it's a very effective way of saying nobody else is ever going to read this. This is private. This is for you. It's no. This is not going to be the final version. It's going to go through like 10 or 12 more revisions minimum by the time it goes through. So don't worry about making it perfect. So like I said, with me, it's a case of I will get a big chunk of words down, then I'll double back and I'll edit and I'll try and get it into a good shape, and then I'll keep doing that. So it's like going forward, then ducking back. So there's a little bit of 2 steps forward, 1 step back going on with me. But then when I get to the end, it means I've got a manuscript that's relatively clean and that I can do something with. That method may not work for everybody. Like, there's a very legitimate school of thought that says you don't ever go back and revise your first draft until you've got it done, because otherwise you'll end up killing yourself going round and round in circles. That's perfectly valid advice. It happens to not work for me, but I can see that being good advice for people and just in general.
Yeah. And I think overall, being able to find that process that works for you and being able to get to the end and being able to know when it's finished, that whole process takes time. It takes practice. And
Mm.
I mean, I always want to encourage other writers to keep writing, to keep revising, to get to the end, to be able to get it out on paper and work through the hard parts, because that's what's going to make you a better writer in the end.
Exactly. And keeping it fun is a big part of it as well. It's like, it's, if it becomes a slog, if it becomes something that you are trudging through, then to my mind, that means you're doing something wrong. You've got to enjoy the process, because if not, that will bleed through onto the page, and you can tell. As I've read published books before where it's very clear, okay, the writer is trying to wrap this up and get paid because they're sick of this at this point. So if you're not interested in it, I guarantee you nobody else will be interested in it either. So you've got to try and keep it exciting for yourself in that sense. That's why, like I said, I don't sit down to start writing unless I know I'm in the mood, I know I'm going to enjoy it, and I know what I'm doing. And that prevents me from getting stuck. It prevents me from having long periods where I haven't got a clue what I'm doing. I'm not sure I believe writer's block's a thing, but I've never had it. And it's because I stick to those two. It's because I stick to those 2 principles.
Yeah, that's very true. All right. Well, do you have anything else that you want to that you would want to say to new writers or struggling writers out there?
Just back to what I said before, make it fun. Go off, tell your stories, enjoy yourself, have a load of fun doing it. And if someone ends up reading it and like it, fantastic. But just keep doing it and make sure you finish. You can have all the greatest ideas in the world you want, but your number one responsibility as a writer is to finish what you're writing. Otherwise, you won't get anywhere.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Adam. I have gone on and I have purchased your book. I'm excited to read it. And
Fantastic.
yeah, I can't wait for that day to come where I can see my book on Amazon. I'm excited for that day. But I have to finish it first. So I'm going to go do that. I'm going to go finish my book.
You do that. You do that. I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with as well, there, Dan.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for meeting with me, and I hope you have a great day.
And you too. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.